Well, welcome. It is good to have you here, and it's great to have Rochelle Masters from Masters Psychology. Welcome, Rochelle.
Thanks, Matt. Nice to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you on here, and I'm nervously anticipating this conversation. I'm actually really excited about it because I think it's just a super important conversation that the church and really just organizations are having
Mm.
as a whole. And I don't think, like, I'm just trying to rack my brain, but I don't think well, not that I have purview of everything, but I don't think I haven't heard anything that I know of that's just kind of like, let's just talk about church leadership. Let's talk about church culture. Let's talk about its effect in a positive, but also a negative kind of light on people. And coming at it from the perspective of humility and wanting to learn and wanting to grow as the church so that we can just ultimately just shepherd like Jesus, right? Like, I think that's the goal, and do it in a really healthy way. So I thought it would be cool to just start with you just taking the opportunity to walk us through kind of your journey, like how you wound up kind of going, I want to be in psychology, or is that something you've always
Oh,
wanted?
oh
And
gosh.
then, what Masters Psychology is all about, what your vision and heart is, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Ah, thanks, Matt. That's really great. Well, yeah, I grew up as a pastor's kid, as you know, and I actually had a great experience as a pastor's kid. Not all pastors' kids do, but I did.
Yeah.
And when I grew up, I wanted to be a pastor's kid. So pursued that hard. When I say pastor's kid, I wanted to grow up working in the church,
Yeah.
and I wanted a continuation of what I had in my youth and young adult years. I loved it. And hubby and I have been on staff at local churches and I guess across that lineage, though, I had a lot of experiences that I didn't understand, and mostly around people care, because that's sort of how I'm wired.
Yeah.
And I remember there was a season of my life where my husband and I were on staff at a local church, and there were sort of 22 staff members that all got sort of made redundant and fired and all sorts all at the same time. And my hubby and I had to sort of go out and get proper jobs. And we didn't really have any qualifications because we'd only ever worked in church.
Yeah.
Anyway, the one thing that I just was good at, or I thought we were all good at it actually, but I loved working with people and ended up studying Matt. I did not want to be a psychologist, and I did not want to run mental health clinics. That was not on my bucket list, I can promise you that much.
Mm.
But through a process of education, I would say, but also a process of like really having a bit of a paradigm shift in my relationship with the Lord, I came to understand that what he was asking of me was to pastor the community outside of the walls of the local church.
Mm.
And that's been a wild ride, and so yeah, now I am the CEO of Master Psychology, which is a group of mental health clinics. We literally have thousands of appointments every year
Mm.
to reduce the suffering associated with mental health issues, to see people thrive. And so there could be tangible, meaningful change. And it's
Mm.
just thinking about that is my favourite thing to do.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
that's what I'm doing, pastoring the community, just not inside the walls of a church.
yeah. Yeah. No, I absolutely love that. And I think there's just such a shift at the moment I've noticed in the last couple of years specifically where just even that bivocational thing for pastors in air quotes, but just the acknowledgement of like ministry is not a thing that happens just because you're on staff at a church, but it's just this wherever you are, you're kind of on mission. God's got
Absolutely.
you. God's got you where you're at, and so that's amazing, and what a phenomenal impact you're making and get to make on a daily basis. So exciting. Thanks for
I know.
all the work that you do in the community. It's incredible.
I really love it. I really do.
That's so cool. I wanted to, today I wanted to kind of theme this conversation and certainly come at it from a very curious student that's wanting to grow and wanting to learn and wanting to get better as a church leader, as a pastor of a church, as someone that does ministry with friends, as all those sorts of things. I'm really passionate about learning and getting better, and ultimately that's what all these conversations I'm having with people are about. But this one's a really important conversation because we haven't done this part well as a church, I don't think, anyway, from my personal experience and kind of worldview. But I'd love to just dive into just a conversation around church culture, around... you know, we all know people, we've all been in churches long enough where some split happens or there's just unhealthy church culture, there's unhealthy church leadership, there's abuse in the church, like let's just call it for what it is, from my perspective anyway. And some of that is emotional, some of it's spiritual, some of it at times is physical. And there's the church can be a messy place, and the church isn't meant to be perfect. Like, we have a perfect Jesus, but you know, I think the truth is that we haven't had the conversation around church leadership, toxic church leadership, narcissism, and, you know, abuse in church life. And so I want to go there today. I want to ask some pretty big questions that may get me in a bit of trouble.
Can of worms.
But yeah, it is a can of worms, and this conversation is not coming from a heart of they're like this and they're like that. Not at all. This is coming from this place of really wanting to learn, but also wanting to help people that either are in a abusive situation, but also for us as church leaders to help identify, like maybe take that log out of our own eye or see some of those blind spots. So that we can lead better. But I might just start by asking, like, how do you identify abusing or controlling leadership kind of cultures or leaders?
Yeah.
Are there some hallmarks that you just go, yep, I can see this, tick, tick, tick?
There are. And, you know, it's, look, in short, a toxic or problematic leadership culture is one where its members experience a high incidence of adverse religious experiences.
Okay.
So a culture where the people participating, there's a high incidence of wounding. And in science we call it an adverse religious experience. Sometimes those adverse religious experiences lead to a trauma injury, but sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
So a toxic culture is one there's a high incidence of those, and they do have some, you know, some hallmarks, I suppose. You know, they tend to be, you know. They tend to be cultures that are characterised by certain things, and I don't know if you want to necessarily go there, you know, but it's one where essentially no one takes responsibility. There's a very entrenched us versus them mentality. The church fights are normalised. You know? We don't communicate directly to a person. We sort of we talk about people rather than to them. It's political, or what happens privately is different to what happens publicly. So there's some big sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sort of themes. Yep. But, you know, there's actually, when I was doing some research into this, I started a PhD on this actually. You know, Matt, I'm a bit nerdy behind the scenes, but there's like 130 different signs. And I didn't want to sort of rattle all those off to you because there's literally 130 of them.
Yeah, wow.
But essentially, in short, there's a high incidence of people experiencing these adverse religious experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe in a friendlier way of asking it is like, what does a healthy church culture look like? And I'm probably more asking pertaining to like me as a person in the church and my relationship with leadership in the church. Because I think, I think things like transparency, accountability, I think
So good.
some of the stuff that I've noticed is missing is like you can't get to the actual person if it's in church leadership that you're having an issue with. I mean, these are just some of my observations. You can't ask that person directly. You've got to ask around to five other people. And do you have any things that you see in a healthy church culture that you might go pertaining to like you being in it and leadership? What you kind of would see as healthy church culture?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess a healthy church culture is one where the beliefs, the religious beliefs, the practices, and the structure do not undermine an individual's sense of safety or autonomy. They're environments that do not negatively impact someone's physical, social, emotional, relational, sexual, psychological well-being. It's a big ask, really, because we are a group of people, after all. But they are environments where the leadership take that seriously in terms of education, supervision, governance. So they're environments that do not undermine the individuals collectively, but it's sort of at an individual level. There's no undermining of someone's safety or autonomy.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And I think the thing that I'm thinking about as you're saying that, the bigger your organisation, church or other gets, the harder that is to kind of have the appropriate cultures and mechanisms to maintain that. Would that be a fair assumption?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally. Because it's sort of easier to kind of go, okay, let's make sure we're not at one that facilitates abuse or neglect. They might be the simpler ones, but the communal practices, like how we deal with those can be a little bit more tricky, perhaps, depending on the population that you're serving. It's a complicated space when it comes to people care, but it doesn't have to be. There are some things that we can do.
This question's just off cuff. It's not on the series of questions that I sent through, but if you were like speaking, say, to senior pastors or key pastors, depending on what their church strategy is, what are kind of like maybe just the big few things, or maybe it's one thing of advice that you would say to a senior leader of creating that kind of healthy, safe church environment?
Education is key.
Okay.
So you don't know what you don't know. And so non-defensive and culture-specific education. Professional practices that everybody else has to abide by leaders. Just as a leader of a mental health clinic, I can't get away with not having a governance model, a communication framework. I can't get away with not having good HR practices, and it's supervision and professional development. I'm actually not allowed to keep my license every year. Unless I can prove that and demonstrate that. So it's actually just having the professional practices that other professionals are expected to live by and to work by. So that would be my big one. And education is key because it's not something that's readily taught.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a lot of our leadership styles have been inherited by the leaders that we've been under or around, and And, you know, I think our generation of leaders the generation of leaders come through the church now are a lot more kind of aware. Like there's a lot more of awareness of this space. But I think I think it's something, you know, hence why I wanted to have this conversation today, is like that education piece. How do we grow? How do we keep growing? If
So
you know,
true. And I can say something on that.
yeah.
I've been doing, I've been for a little while doing the psychometric testing for pastors of lots of different denominations. And just some denominations require like a bit of a, you know, fit for work sort of test or a psychometric testing for pastors, just to kind of make sure that risk is mitigated and, you know, they're a healthy individual, you know. And one of the things that comes up consistently with pastors, I almost have to like get my head around it, is that there's this in positive impression management. There's always an towards spinning who they are, but what they stand for with a positive, like positively. So it makes them think, or that they seem to think, or sometimes they set things up in a way that's spun in a positive way. So they don't, the common shortcomings, you know, pastors are not expected to be free from the common shortcomings that the rest of us, you know, have. It's just the way that we spin it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. What do you put that down to? Like, is that a performance thing that we live in, or what, or is it different for every individual?
Actually, a lot of it is around theology. It's around the theology of like the, you know, faith that God has chosen me and I'm called to this particular work, which is good and true, and then the stewardship of that theology and how that actually flows into professional practice. There can be a gap in that space.
Is that are you like explaining almost like a savior type of mentality? Like I'm the person that's going to do it, and so
called, chosen, and therefore I don't have. There's a sense of grandiosity in some instances, and it's not inherent in their personality. Like they want to serve the community and they want to reach this people group and so on, but then this mentality that then therefore they are above or don't really need to take seriously mental health first aid, or they don't really need to have as robust HR processes because, you know, watered down. So it's got a spin to it often. It's interesting.
Wow. Oh, it is. How do you what would you suggest to someone that maybe they are, or maybe they think they are, maybe they're unsure, but they're kind of feeling like they're in an unhealthy / dangerous kind of church culture, and they're confused, they're kind of trapped in that, you know, thing of like, well, this is just what everyone does. Do you have any advice well, maybe not advice per se directly, but do you have any thoughts on, you know, what's something, you know, just broad brush stuff that people can do in those environments?
Yeah, I do. So I guess the first thing that's probably important to say is that if someone is already injured, because you can be actually injured, much like you can be injured playing sport, you can have an actual injury as being a part of a toxic or problematic church culture. If you're already injured, you don't start with confronting your church culture. You have to deal with your wound first. And that may seem like a, you know, like a sort of, when I was thinking about that, I was thinking, oh, that's going to fly in the face of Matthew 18, where it talks about go to the person first, you know. We're meant to, you know, I'm not meaning, I don't want to fly in the face of, you know, the gospel. However, the context of that passage is that it assumes that we can articulate our offence.
Yeah.
And people find it really tricky, Matt, to articulate what is happening for them. They really do. It has, when people have adverse religious experiences, and if they are in a toxic culture, it has a way of really confusing them. It's part of the symptom. It's part of the sign of an injury. And so then to kind of then go up to confront this person or leader or whatever it might be actually can make the injury so much worse. So what I say is almost like you have to do your little risk assessment. You know, can I articulate well? Which means, have I got enough distance to articulate my grievance or my area of confusion or suffering that allows me to also, you know, kind of be able to protect myself? And if so, great. Then perhaps ask your church or your leader what the policy is around having some of these hard conversations. You know, what do we do? What do we do if there's a grievance or you know, we need to have a hard conversation, or we want to sort of with appreciative inquiry say, look, I'm not sure about this.
Yeah.
Figuring out what your church policies are around that. But if there is a risk that you can't articulate your concerns well, there's not enough distance, and you have to go and do some work first. And that's where you make it doing that your own work and sort of figuring out what your own injury is, if there is one. Then you can make a plan to how you would then approach these conversations.
Yeah.
I would also say not to go to someone, though. You don't seek counsel from someone who has a church chip on their shoulder.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, because then you're just going to, their stuff is going to transfer to you, and then you're going to have injury upon injury, or, you know, it's going to be lost.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a few tips, I would say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this isn't Rochelle saying it. This is Matt Garner saying it, and this are the parts that I'll probably get in trouble. But if you find yourself in a church leadership environment that you can't have those conversations because the culture says that you can't, you're in an unhealthy church culture, in my personal opinion.
Oh, yeah. There's a risk there that you're going to be injured. And then in that risk, like any domestic violence risk, any risk, you got to get out of there.
Yeah, for sure.
But you might need support in which to do so, because it's...
Yeah, because there's this sense I find that, like, even in cultures where it's like things are going forward and things are like, and this has been, you know, this is going back from when I was a kid, right? So this isn't recent stories. This is going back from when I was a kid, growing up in my early 20s. It's like things can look really good, like they're growing and everything's happening, and they can be. And for one person, they can be a wonderful experience. But that doesn't necessarily mean the leadership culture is right. And I think the challenge for leaders is to take a step back and go, all right, you know, there are a few things here that are happening that are great, but there's some things here that we need to get better at in inclusivity. And, you know, just, I look back on my days as a youth pastor, I'm like, gee, I was an absolute moron. Like, and I've had to apologize to a lot of people over the years of just like valuing program and performance over people. And, you know, there's been a lot of just moments of just going back 10, 15, 20 years later and just saying, hey, I'm really sorry. I was terrible. Firstly, I was a terrible witness of who Jesus should be. And that's the part that can hurt the most, I think, eternally speaking. But, you know, just on a human level as well, like, you know, it's like we talk about unity. It's like, yeah, that's not just with the super elite, that's with everyone, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of self-awareness needed, isn't there, as a leader. And I think you're right, things can be really fruitful in some domains, and then that doesn't mean, though, that you don't mitigate against the aspects that may not be encompassing enough in terms of caring for those who see things differently or who may need extra additional support.
Yeah. So say someone, Rochelle's in that situation like you're explaining before, where they come into an environment wounded. Is your experience that person either probably doesn't know they're wounded when they come in? Like, is there a case where people come in and it's like they've got childhood trauma, or they've got like just their story of origin. You know, they come like, so for me, for my story, it'd be like, you know it, but like I grew up without a dad playing the dad role, like distant father. So I always gravitated towards affirmation. And so when older men affirmed me, it was like, bam, this is awesome. Praise, this is what I needed. But actually it was, I came into different environments that, and I thank God for those men and for those moments, right? But also at the same time, it was tending to a wound that I didn't know was there.
Oh, absolutely. And what's ironic about this, Matt, is that if you read the Mental Health Commission's mental health strategy, so this is how the government and our nation plans to help people with mental health concerns, they recommend that psychologists, people like me, detour people through places like the local church or sporting facilities or libraries to act, belong, commit. So not only, you know, do we need community, but, you know, some of our governing bodies sort of say, well, let's plant people in places like the local church. And yet the local church isn't always ready for that and hasn't always been across that in the way that is needed in terms of understanding around, like just from a mental health perspective, you know, in people's well-being, understanding like what is needed to be able to cater to that and what is mental health first aid and, you know, how do I facilitate a safe environment?
Yeah. You've mentioned mental health first aid a few times. I have no idea, like, help me to understand that a little bit better. And on that, as a kind of dovetail to that question, what are some practices like for that person that, you know, psychologists or other health professionals are, you know, trying to connect people into church life as a safe, healthy church environment? What are some tips for me as a pastor that, hey, Matt, here are some things that you can do in your church to create that safe environment?
Absolutely. I think we've touched on it before when we were saying education is key.
Yeah.
So, not, you know, just the professional practices that other leaders, other organisations have to abide by are included in your particular church. And so that is having an awareness and or having engaged in mental health first aid. So that's like, you know, like how you might have to do a first aid certificate. You can do a mental health first aid, but you can do one specific to spiritual first aid as well. And I'm not, it depends which course you do. So some of the courses are just, you know, you'll get an education about what is depression, what is anxiety, and that can be helpful, but that's not where it ends. It's more like, well, what does it mean to be a trauma-aware environment, for example, and how to have mental health aware, culturally, you know, equity, diverse, inclusive, aware practices. So it's all of those types of things where education is really where you start, good governance around that, talking to your affiliate body, denomination around, okay, well, you know, what does this look like? What does good governance look like? What does good HR processes look like? You know, where do we get our, you know, education from? But also pastoral, like going to a qualified supervisor. As a pastor is really important. Again, myself, I'm not allowed to practice as a psychologist without demonstrating that I've had a level of supervision and professional development for the previous year. And pastors are the same. Like, so I don't think it's a regulated thing, but it's in some denominations it is. But, you know, it just actually having really good supervisory professional practices around professional development, education, training, and keeping that going and the depth. Yeah, so that would be the main things, Matt.
Yeah, no, I love that. Coming back to what we were just touched on before, how do you identify like areas of your life that kind of cause you to lean into some of these church cultures when you don't realise that they're there?
I know. This is a loaded question, really, isn't it? You know, it's actually about
This could be a whole series of podcasts that we're going to do. Book your calendar out. Oh.
You know what, though? In short, you'd have to do your own work around this because there's so many individual differences. Like I think about my sort of appetite for, the type of denominations I'm sort of towards or that I affiliate with, or there's faith, the expressions of faith that I sort of come to life within, and the leadership that I come to life listening to is all framed, and it's all like individual to me and contextual to me. And I just think people will have their own. There can be a lot of wounding around that, of course, and we could really psychoanalyze that till we're blue in the face.
Sure.
But I think you'd have to do your own work around that. So that means that, you would actually, in your own reflective practices and or contemplative practices, or even counselling, psychology practice, if you needed to go and do some work around this, it would be around, I keep warming my hands by a fire that shouldn't be burning. Why do I do this? And really going into a deep dive around that. I think that's a personal challenge.
Yeah. To
really becoming self-aware around why that might be the case, if that is the case, that we keep being drawn to problematic relationships or cultures of, with there's too many red flags.
Yeah. 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 No, it's challenging to kind of start to try to think about trying to see something that you don't know is there. It's those blind spots. It's those and I think there's like two parts to this conversation, right? Like this the part where it's like, I'm a church leader. I want to create a healthy environment.
Totally.
I want to, coming at it from that aspect. The other aspect is coming at from I'm in a church community. I want to be as whole as I can to contribute to the community in a healthy way. But I have these blind spots, and they're called blind spots because they're things that I can't see. In kind of the kind of psychology world, like, am I hearing you say that, like, probably one of the greatest things you can do is sit down and actually have a conversation with a professional to help you identify some of those things?
I think so, and I understand how bias and how that's of course a psychologist is going to say that, but I don't mean to do that. I think it's quite widely accepted that we all, as we grow and develop across our lifespan, we gather wounds, and we have unmet needs, and we have fears, and we look to repair those wounds in adulthood that we developed somewhere along the way. And to actually be self-aware about that, and to sort of uncover that and go, what is this unmet need? And I'm going to I'm going to sort of cope with that wound in a certain way. What am I doing that for? Because I keep, if there's a problematic or an unhealthy pattern there, then it's one that can be uncovered. And it doesn't have to be like horrid. It's actually a process of self-awareness, or it's a reflective practice.
Yeah. If you've experienced church trauma or hurt or abuse, or, probably falls under a whole lot of different titles, depending on people's experience. But, and maybe the answer's similar to what you just said then before around like seeing someone and talking about it. But do you have any kind of tools or tips for people to kind of start that healing journey? I know from pastoring people for many, many years that a lot of times people, and also churches, they just don't have the tools. And especially if the hurt has happened inside of the church community, but then the church community is the thing that's meant to heal, that's actually difficult. Adds a layer of kind of complexity to the healing. Do you have any kind of tools or
I do.
Tips?
I do. So, you have to understand the nature of your injury first. So let's say you've had some adverse religious experiences.
Can you give us a couple of case scenarios? Just
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Well,
hypotheticals. Like, I got slapped by the pastor on the front row or something. No, probably not that bad, but that's quite self-explanatory.
Well, a lot of people have engaged in, faith organisations where the beliefs or the practices or the structure undermines their safety or their autonomy. And I've just sort of got too many flying around. I don't want to trigger anyone who's listening.
Fair enough.
But, there is. And just because you have those experiences doesn't mean you will have a trauma injury. So the word trauma gets thrown around a lot. However, religious trauma is an actual injury that you can sustain as a result of an adverse religious experience. So to get help, you would need to understand the nature of your injury. Again, just like when I've been skiing down Mount Hotham, injured myself, what is the nature of this injury, and therefore how am I going to rehabilitate that injury, and therefore would I go skiing again? Sort of thing. It's a very similar type of injury. It's an actual physical structure. It has neurobiology to it. If you have an injury, you need to understand the nature of the injury first, and good treatment is available. So different injuries need different treatments. And so post-traumatic stress disorder is a type, that's probably one of the most severe injuries you can have as a trauma injury. And you can sustain a post-traumatic stress disorder injury as a result of religious trauma. However, the whole point of participating in treatment for that injury is post-traumatic growth. And so post-traumatic growth is actually what we know happens as a result of having treatment. So I guess one of the steps in this country, amazingly, our Medicare allows us to go to our GP and activate a mental health treatment plan, which is like a contract between you and the GP that activates a bank of sessions through Medicare that you can have treatment for injuries such as religious trauma. So you need to go to your GP, you book a longer consult because you want to talk about a query around an injury that you may have sustained and having someone look at that injury. And then your GP actually works with you to make sure that you get the treatment that you need by the appropriately qualified person who understands, preferably, what a religious trauma wound is. But that's not always necessary, to be honest. You can actually have treatment for trauma and trauma injuries by a trauma specialist without, it's good when they understand the context of the particular environment you've come against. But that's really up to the professional to name whether or not they feel competent and able to do that. And then you go through a period, we call it a phased approach. So actually what it means to establish safety, what it means to stabilise symptoms that come as a result of that. Maybe you had bad dreams, maybe you're having panic attacks. They're the most common ones, Matt. People that have had horrendous things happen at church, they usually start with indicating that they're injured, and it starts in the form of panic attacks or problems sleeping, nightmares and things. So you need to have...
I was going to ask that, like, how do you know you're wounded?
You're injured, yeah. So, and then what you want to know is like, well, if I've been injured, what is the nature of this injury? We're talking like a low-level injury, or we're talking about a high-level injury? So someone who's qualified needs to really look at that. But the steps are safety, symptom stabilisation. So you can actually have those panic attacks addressed, that sleep dysregulation addressed, the anxiety addressed, for example. And then you learn how to you have some treatment for your injury that's really effective, and then you can look after yourself. We call that integration. You can actually make choices about, okay, well, my expression of faith is really important to me, and so then how am I going to engage in an environment where that is going to be protective for me rather than, cause me to be re-injured. So, there are steps, and any psychologist, clinical psychologist, learns about trauma injuries and how to address those. It's not just a psychologist, there's some counsellors and, pastoral supervisors that also learn this in their training. Mm-hmm. So, there's really helpful tools out there. But typically, certainly where I'm from, WA, it starts with going to the GP and booking a longer consult and saying, I need someone to look at this area of my life. I have been impacted by my faith community in a problematic way, and I'd like to activate my my treatment plan. And obviously the GP's involved in assessing that. There's steps that you take to that. Yep. And a process, but it's something that we can then have readily and really good effective treatment format.
Yeah. You were saying about PTSD, and what did you call the
post-traumatic growth?
Yeah. Can you explain what that is?
Absolutely. Like with any recovery from any injury, there are signs and symptoms that you are getting better. And when it comes to a trauma injury, the pathway to getting better and the signs that you're getting better that's called post-traumatic growth. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like a medical term that we use.
Okay. Yeah.
And so that would be when someone starts to recover, their wound isn't as sensitive anymore. They're not having the same symptoms that they were having that indicated they were injured in the first place.
Yeah.
They start to indicate that they're actually it's just not as sensitive. It doesn't repeat all the time. It's not as triggering, if we can use that word. Yeah. And there's particularly, depending on your injury though, those signs and symptoms will be different for different people. And the pathway out of there, so the path to post-traumatic growth is different depending on what sort of injury you have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And
so it's like quite a medical model I'm talking about.
Yeah. It's good, and it's it's just making me think the church, I suppose, tradition that I've been a part of, which has largely been the Pentecostal church. We live in this kind of, we haven't done that part well and we probably haven't allowed people to do it well either, because we've been in this hyper faith land, which has been you should just come up the front of church on a Sunday morning, someone's going to pray for you, and you should walk away fine. And if you don't, there's something broken with you still. And as a result of that kind of, I think, culture just in a lot of the Pentecostal tradition, not all of it, obviously, but a lot of it, we haven't really given people the opportunity, I like how you're explaining it in the sense of it's like every other kind of, I've broken my leg skiing, injury. And it takes time. And I think I would just want to encourage people that are in that kind of world just to say, hey, healing takes time. Not everything happens at an altar. In fact, I think God purposely doesn't do things in those moments we think he should, because he's doing something far deeper and greater that we just can't comprehend at the time. But to encourage someone that's listening today to just say, hey, your healing's not always going to be instant. It takes time. And just keep walking out the journey, because it does get better.
Yeah, and it takes different formats. That's probably my surprise in this sitting where I'm sitting. I sit across a room from thousands of people and watching their healing journey, and it takes so many different formats. It doesn't mean it's not God-breathed if it doesn't happen instantaneously on an altar call.
Yeah, well said.
And,
it's I'm lost in thought, because there's just so much. I think this is just a really important conversation for the church to be having and engaging on, because sadly, people they will, and they will continue, because the church is led by broken people. People unfortunately will continue to find themselves getting hurt and injured and all those sorts of things. And so I just wanted
It's
to
real
provide.
cultural relevance too, Matt. Like,
Yeah.
I was speaking to someone who's church planting from Japan recently, and it was like I was speaking another language, like mental health and its implications, and it just happens so differently there. So it's also a complicated space culturally, and it really does depend on who you're serving, and what good governance, good safe churches, what all of those practices, mental health, first aid, like, are going to look like, and how they're going to be shaped.
Yeah. 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 No, absolutely. But hopefully this has just provided a bit of kind of help, I suppose, and just know that people are wanting to talk about these sorts of things, and there is help out there.
There is help. There's really good help.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I want to encourage people, like just what you're saying there at the end around, like, there's a lot of ways that people find that healing or that sense of growth out of, those places of injury. And so one of the things to acknowledge is that often we don't have the tools or the ability to heal. We don't have the tools ourselves. And so that's why God put us in family, put us in community, and encourage anyone that's out there to seek help. And work out what that pathway is. Might just be a conversation with someone close to them that they can trust at this point in time, that then can help them get help. Or it might be a church leader, or it might be going and seeing a professional, whether it's a GP, a psychologist, or whoever. But the point is help's out there, right? And as you said, good help. We just need to go and access it.
Yeah, and a lot of people want that to come from the place that injured them, and that's not always the first or the best port of call, certainly initially.
Yeah, yeah. Why do you think people do that?
I think they want to reason, with, can you please see it from my perspective? This is how it's hurt me. This is what's happening. This is how it's affecting my life. And everything has dialectic, or lots of things have more than one perspective. And I just don't know that people always articulate themselves very well when they've been injured. We can say ouch, but we can't necessarily explain, when it comes to these types of injuries, exactly what it is that's hurt us. It is much easier. If you slipped over and fell at church and you had a swollen ankle, we can all see, oh, there we go. Oh, dear. Geez, we better take that cord down next time. Those sorts of practices are a little bit easier. But actually, like, the psychological injuries are a little bit more complex to articulate. And it's best to go and do some work, do some tidy up and some understanding and some clarity and some safety first, and then approach what you need to approach. Yeah.
No, awesome. Rochelle, thanks so much for your time today.
No worries.
It's been such a good conversation. So much further and deeper we could go on specific topics, but maybe we'll save that for another time. Would you mind just sharing with people where they can connect with you, whether it's on social media, or what's the best place to
Absolutely
find out what you're doing?
Yeah, so we're on socials. But probably the best place is to our website, so www.masterspsychology.com.au, and there's lots of information there. But we're on Facebook and Insta and LinkedIn as Masters Psychology, and you can find us there.
Awesome, cool. Well, thanks so much for your time. I know it's been a really helpful conversation for so many people.
Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
See ya.
See ya.